When I'm arrested, they'll call me a traditionalist that formed an early obsession with reminiscent material under the eyes of a reactionary father, and to be completely honest with you, they will be right. I have always loved nature. It began with a hardback book my father brought home from the riverbed market, a rarity sold by an antiques dealer near the bank, all dog-eared and once beloved. We spent the afternoon turning through its odd archaic pages, lingering on every illustration of a leaf or a flower, each with their own vibrancy despite the fading ink. He told me once, through stifled laughter, that it was the only time I'd ever sat still. I remember, though he seemed to forget, that he always wanted to turn the pages first, much to my dismay, of course. Don't get me wrong, he was interested in them. Who wouldn't be? But the trees, bushes, flowers, petals, they were not so much an oddity for him as they were for me. He'd been alive, for a short while at least, before the floods and the fires were finished, before their embers were quenched by the tide. Sitting me on his lap that evening, he told tales of how leaves would have grown and then fallen from trees, littering the ground and crunching underfoot, and that not only had these things been in every corner of your eye in every second of your day, but that in fact we were reading from their remnants. An obsession bloomed then and there in that rigid, inked carcass. 15 years later, I was appointed director of the nation's own nursery. I was on Westminster Bridge when I was told, standing right near the palace, a pale, limp light pouring through its Gothic panes and diffusing into the smog. Sickly rain was spitting against my waterproof, the sound like a distant percussion. The acid proofing was expensive, but it's always worth the price. The smell, that acrid smell of sulphur, permeated everything. We've never bothered trying to hide it. My comm collar rang, silencing the rain and footfall. I dusted the flaky paint off my hands onto the shoppers below me and answered. Dr. Soul Might? I recognized the voice from the interview, somewhat meek but otherwise clear and direct. Speaking? My stomach trembled. We would like to formally offer you the position of director at the nation's own nursery. She sounded both proud and relieved. Congratulations. We'll see you tomorrow. I accepted, obviously. It should have been an honour. If you're one of the few who still read state media, you might have seen the headline, Youngest Director of NON Appointed. That was me. I thought that I'd finally made it. I was ecstatic. I couldn't wait to see a natural wonder. But I never did. They'll call me an ingrate for that, and say that I was radicalised in youth by an obsession with extremist material. You see it all the time in headlines. But to their credit, this is also at least in part true. My father would jostle through the Thames on a near daily basis and return with whatever he could find related to plant life. Books were just as uncommon then, most having been digitised and burned for fuel in the harshest of times, and while the one we did have was a prideful possession, it was secreted away from the eyes of guests in a kitchen drawer for safekeeping. Our only other room was, however, strewn with our obsession, the trophies of my father's hunt. Terror sheets, for example, lay everywhere, some in boxes, some on the floor, and some remained unfurled for days on our multi-purpose table, demanding an audience for the nature they contained. I would spend hours in their bush, weeding out the beauty hidden in their multitude. It was my father's idea to decorate the place with them. The hours we spent tacking and taping those crystalline sheets to our once white walls were some of the happiest of my life. We swiped through each one to find the best images, our favourites by way of vote. Oak, sycamore, rhododendron and chrysanthemum, pine and orchid all then littered that little room. Once finished, you couldn't see the wall for the trees. A few years later, Dad struck gold under the Millennium Bridge. In one technology stall or another, he found a small trunk's worth of nodes, an extinct and expensive attempt at VR from late the previous century, perhaps 100 in total. We spent weeks combing through them. After strapping on our haptic collars, which gave a short prick to the base of our skull, we perused through one experience after the other, some rather unsavoury, scouring world after world for any hint of foliage. Finally, after hours of the 21st century in war and Royal Cruise International, the Great British Isles, we found our grail, dust-ridden and stickerless at the bottom of the trunk. The Forest of Dean. 36 square kilometres of wilderness digitised for the purposes of ecotherapy. Once we caught sight of disaster, the species scrambled, battened down the hatches, and fought desperately for necessities and little luxuries. One man, however, armed with only a small flock of drones and dogs, wandered through the now submerged forest to preserve its memory, believing, as I do now, that we would miss more than anything its serenity. I regret not looking him up while I had the chance. He seemed a good man. He would have been long dead even in my childhood, but worthy of being remembered, I think. So much of what is not. Luckily, the note still worked. From our flat 6 stories up, besieged by that damned smog with a view of only the packed street below and the windowless concrete opposite, my father and I would meander through trodden paths and rabbit trails amongst the peace of wild things. It must have taken years. Each tree, each bush, each daisy and buttercup were rendered perfectly, down to their very smell. The leaves of every tree, whether birch, beech, alder, or buckthorn, were a law unto themselves, careening and swooning in every breath of wind. They crunched underfoot as was promised. Taking one between my fingers, I could feel their waxy surface strung taut between rigid arteries, and trace my finger along the border of their myriad shapes. I will miss them. Often, my father and I would walk together in silence, eavesdropping on the branches as they moaned about the breeze of a constant summer. The city's intrusions, the horns, the yells, the screeches and sirens all evaporated here and were replaced by the chirping and creaking of wilderness. Our own silent kingdom, refuge from the world outside that berates for the sake of itself. My mind could be blank, be at peace, be removed from that bustling city without that creates one within. Despite the space, the scenery, the promise of endless discovery, nothing was ever demanded of me there. Instead, I was permitted to be still, to be wild, to just be. You have to understand that for me this was all but hallucinatory, psychedelic even. I stood amongst monoliths sprung from the very earth, each untamed and yet rooted in place, colonizing the sky first with trunk, then branch, and finally with canopy. Our concrete jungles pale in comparison. When light broke through those dancing leaves, it was golden, gilding every thicket, thorn, and flower on the forest floor. I wept more than once at the mere sight. Sometimes I weep at the memory. But those tears only clouded my view. They steamed up the glasses I forgot were on my nose, so I'd remove them, wipe away the tears, and readjust, for longer than I would care to admit, to being back in those 4 walls, with that same view. I supplemented my education, if you can call it that, with textbooks and encyclopedias that I downloaded illegally from the undernet and stored on an old tablet safe from prying eyes. The Mental Health and Resiliency Act had been recently enacted, but already there were ways of accessing reminiscent material, even for a child like me. I'd have done anything to see the old world. It's much more inviting than our current one. If you get the chance, read as much of it as you can. It's worth the risk. Trust me. Anyway, after years of this secret study, I applied to the Historical Institute of Terran Biology to formally specialise in all that was once living, now dead. While only recently opened, it was already somewhat prestigious, and I, caught in its prestige, I suppose, thought naively that some of the forest's peace could be found behind its wrought iron doors. While it's true that some projects do attempt to develop plants capable of growing once more on the surface, they do so with a minute supply of living genetic material. It's a noble pursuit. However, the Institute's primary purpose, though rarely publicised, is and always was the preservation of knowledge for future generations. Or, perhaps more honestly, whatever happens to find our ruins. In either case, they would know that we had been here. They'd know what we had been, and they'd know that we knew it too. Over the years there, I attempted to express my fascination with the natural world to fellow students. I figured that there had to be at least one like-minded person in a place like that, but perhaps it was my own fault, my own awkwardness or intensity that did it, because every time I tried, I was greeted with an air of polite passivity, like I was a drunk, persisting with another unwanted tale. I remember once, actually, while glancing at archived photographs, turning to my friend Owen, well, acquaintance, really, and saying, "Look at what we did to Hyde Park. Can you believe it used to look like this?" "It's very green," he said, taking the photograph. "It's insane." His face contorted as he left a long, pregnant pause, considering probably how best to deal with me, and then answered indifferently, "It is what it is." Then he left. The others felt the same as he did. All were there to change the world, but only in the ways that the world would allow. So I kept to myself after that. Instead, I read alone during sociable hours, mostly nature poetry or whatever I managed to sneak out of the archives. And after 4 years of studying, my head in the forest as much as the files, I graduated near the top of my class in nativist plant species, with a minor in propagation and nourishment. Most went into pharmaceuticals, hoping to squeeze out a living wage. The rest remained at the institute, logging archives below ground. I, instead, returned home to live with my father. Our walks in the wild became strolls along trails, which then became hobbles on path. Eventually, we took to just sitting together on the grass, feeling each blade graze each palm. He'd always sit with me and listen to my ramblings about one species or another, but I think he was just being polite. Paternal, you know. I think he began to pull away, to spare me disappointment. After months of searching for a job I thought might never come, going as far to check the French and German enclave listings, I heard from an old professor that the NON was looking for a new director. I'd heard of this place before, obviously, but only ever from those sleek advertisements in Soho or what remained of Chelsea. There were rumours at the Institute, too, that the more well-funded projects would sometimes purchase material from them at extortionate prices, which were then supposedly kept private. I knew it might be my only chance to see real, live nature, but still, I tried not to get my hopes up. I applied, and after an application letter and short interview, I was surprisingly accepted. God, I was overjoyed. I remember the first day well. It was a disaster. I mean, it was a cordial affair, don't get me wrong. I was greeted at reception by a member of the board who led me through into a lounge plush with leather sofas, oak tables, and crystal champagne flutes. Pure luxury. Aluminum ply with matte black lettering decried "Welcome, Director," and was pulled taut between two suspensors a few metres above the ground. The epitome of modern aestheticism. After pleasantries were exchanged, more so between themselves than me, all but one of the board members left, leaving me alone with Professor Ern Rickles, the largest individual shareholder. "A pleasure to finally meet you, Dr. Might. I'm delighted to have you on board," he said while firmly gripping my right hand. "Do you have any questions, any worries or concerns before we begin the tour?" "My only real concern, sir, is for the trees," I said. No, not to worry. There's no need to concern yourself with them." I thought he misunderstood me, but his meaning became immediately clear. He led me out of the lounge, underneath that garish banner, and through a set of automatic, ornately grooved oak doors. Past them lay a revolving door which descended very gradually into the city's bowels for what felt to me like miles. Finally, at its end was a narrow, porcelain-white corridor, which allowed no more than 2 abreast, lit from above and below by panels of quartz glass. At its end lay the nursery. Here it is, our pride and joy. Between floor tiles of gleaming porcelain, stretching out before me in countless parallel rows, were undeniably plants. The trees were by far the most noticeable, each at an identical height, standing stationary in the warehouse's clinical lighting. They tapered off with distance like the columns of a ruined temple. I searched frantically for any break from the monotony, found none. All that could be said to be satisfying was the perfectly spherical shape of the treetops, like lollipops for plucking. In the middle of each square, the corners formed by 4 separate trees, sat squat, meagre bushes, pruned to obscenity. Each and every living thing here was separated from one another by that clinical white void of porcelain, and permitted only a patch of soil 4 by 4 feet in which to grow. "Splendid, isn't it?" said Ern, turning to me with a grin. He must have thought me impressed. Behind me, on the wall to which the corridor adjoined, were stacked right to the ceiling innumerable black pyramids, tessellating to form a reflective surface. I remember one detaching, descending to head height and floating languidly away from the two of us along the natural corridor of oak. It startled me as it came into view, but the professor reassured me, asking me to simply watch it hover over a plumage of chrysanthemum, sprout its grotesque bouquet of spindly metallic fingers, and begin cutting away that which it deemed unnecessary. The cuttings fell to the floor and were incinerated on impact. I choked back tears. I asked the professor to leave, which he promised he would do only after he showed me my office. This room, which sits above the whole wretched affair, is reached by a staircase in a state of disrepair. It amounts to no more than 10 meters by 8, with a large bay window overlooking the nursery. Beneath that lies a workstation, dotted with an array of grime-laden plastic buttons from which I was promised control of the entire operation. I was assured, however, that I would never need it, and that those miraculous little drones would take care of everything, including delivery. Hurriedly, perhaps seeing the horror on my face, he left without shaking my hand. For the first few months I didn't dare leave that office. I spent my days there, watching through plexiglass as the drones, detecting the slightest imperfection, detached from their monochrome wall and corrected to specification. There were times when, if they came too close, I had to look away. I realized rather early on that my title of director really meant caretaker, but they paid well nonetheless. I distracted myself from the onslaught with whatever I could find to read, but it amounted to nothing more than antiquated repair manuals and catalogues which listed the plants as products along with their price tags. Like clockwork, every 2 weeks, which is all the time it took to grow the most popular product, oak, the plants were sheathed from below by a polished sleeve of black metal and retracted into the porcelain void. Then they were delivered to the registered address, either in orbit or elsewhere. And all I could do was watch. I never knew where they were headed, who had bought them, or even who could possibly afford them. I didn't want to. I could never bring myself to tell my dad the truth. I feigned excitement for the first few weeks, describing the plant's health, the variety, the number of seeds that were kept in the germ store, and so on. Once I even managed to bring him a leaf, and he loved it, but I think he knew. I think he always knew. It wasn't long before he started asking, "How was work?" And I started replying, "It is what it is." We took one final walk through the forest. I helped him to his feet and held his arm while we shuffled through a clearing. He reached up to pluck a leaf with his right hand and caressed it with thumb and forefinger until we sat down on a wayward bench. There, he took my hand, rested his head on my shoulder, and took in the wilderness one final time before drifting off to sleep. I suffered a cloudy view. The next morning he was dead. There was nothing left unsaid. I loved him and he loved me, we both knew it, but death, grief, can make everything seem undone. He was cremated the next afternoon. They'll say this is why I did it, some form of revenge for the death of my father, whose life I've deemed to be less than he deserved, that in grief I finally broke. Here, they would be wrong. After my father died, the nursery became a non-entity. I continued going to work, but I was no longer depressed by those impressions of nature. I'd lost too much to care. I could stroll along the rows of that preternatural forest, hearing only the solid thunk of my boots on pristine tile, and feel nothing. The vaulted ceiling above, strewn with fluorescent lights, offered no warmth, no golden light to gild. The sky here is a white of threatening brilliance. Yesterday, I absent-mindedly plucked an oak leaf. Taking it between my fingers, I felt that same waxy skin strung taut between rigid veins, and, momentarily, I was satisfied, reassured that some peace might still be found. I dared, though, to touch another, and it was, in every possible way, identical. Its grooves and gorges matched perfectly the other. My fingers found no surprise. And another, from another tree, again identical. I panicked then. I ran. I was trapped down there in that ordered madness, screaming and ranting and stamping the floor, but my efforts only echoed amongst those things. Not trees, not plants, only virtually so. I cried then too, but the tears just fell. This is my confession. On August 9th, 2178, I, Dr. Soul Might, sabotaged the nation's own nursery. I feel no remorse. I took control and ordered every drone to plant as many seeds and saplings as possible in what little soil lies at the base of each plant. They swarm now, filling the air with a gentle hum. It's the first time this place has ever felt alive. I've erased all future delivery information and input coordinates for peaks I hope might still have soil viable for growth. I've also scheduled a complete erasure of the nursery's data in the hopes that their location is never discovered. Finally, I took my father's urn under one arm and strolled amongst those once wild things, scattering a handful of ash amongst the roots. My hands, as I type, are still covered in him. Once the drones retire, I'll attach this file to each transport, along with as many items of reminiscent material as possible, and activate delivery. In unison, those black cigar-shaped cylinders will emerge and engulf the would-be forest. With a final, vacuous gasp, all will be sucked beneath the void, leaving only me and an empty urn. I think I will take the long way home tonight, through the market, and go for a walk in our forest, if I get the time. Undoubtedly, I will never see what I've done, nor, for that matter, the light of day again. But it's okay. I'm finished here. I find solace in the hope that those peaks, scorched from above and salted from below, might provide a freedom to the confined. Remember that while we have made this world as ash, ash is fertile loam. I pray they should be wild once more.